evening, we will have a keynote address. And this keynote address by none other than Professor Gufu Oba, who is in the room. And Professor Oba is a professor emeritus from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and is now an honorable retired elder who lives here in Isiolo and Marsabit. Most of the time does his own stuff now. He has herds of cattle and goats that he takes care of. But when called upon, he comes around to share his wisdom. He has over 40 years of experience in research and teaching on matters drylands, and particularly on issues around ecology, environmental history, anthropology, pastoralism, name it. He has quite a number of papers published. I think he has stopped recording papers published, over 80 plus. And to the best of my knowledge, he has 5 books that have been published on various subjects on pastoralism, northern Kenya, generally the environments around the drylands. In his retirement now, he is also a CEO and a founder of a local organization called Gadis Gumi Foundation, which is a non-profit organization that works for pastoralist communities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gufu Oba to give us a 30 minutes address to set the tone for our event. Professor, karibu.
It's such a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to come and talk to you. I am not quite sure if you hear me well from this microphone. And my lecture is going to be a little bit old-fashioned in the way that I have slides, but I prefer to just give a lecture. And I can see we have many visitors here, but then our composition academically is probably different. And I have, for that reason, following the advice of Dr. Hussein, to kind of give a mixed kind of presentation as opposed to very technical presentation. I would like to look at historical research of science and development in East Africa, in particular related to drylands, how science was and has and is being used for purposes of development. The question actually which needs to be asked is that, is there any link between the research that we do and the development that is done by others? You will see that by the end of this lecture that actually there is very little connection between science and its application. Either the science is misapplied or development is conducted without the use of science. That is the argument that we want to present. So, I would use historical basis to argue my points that I have just mentioned, but there are a number of questions need to be asked. Why has it been problematic applying science for development, particularly in African situations, since we have people from Ghana and Nigeria? And I think it is a similar problem that they have within the Sahelian zone of Africa, which I am familiar with. I have been to Mali, at least not Ghana or Nigeria, but I've been to Mali, therefore I know a little bit of that region. So, one would realize that when trying to apply science for development, this scientific argument or thinking is based on some kind of hypotheses or theories that exist. Oftentimes, these theories are developed elsewhere, not in Africa. But they are scientifically valid arguments, one would say. The question is, of course, whether they are, the way they are used, they are exactly applicable to African situation. The simple reason is that these theories are developed under different climatic conditions and socioeconomic conditions, and whether their application, direct application, within African context actually has either helped Africa or not at all. The further question I want to ask is, what are the challenges in looking at this historical perspective of the use of science for development? Actually, this lecture, in a way, is based on my book, which is called African Environmental Crisis. That book is available. You can download it. It's free of charge. If you go to Google and just search African Environmental Crisis, the application of use of science for development, and it has some very interesting material there. So let's look at this issue of historical use of science for development within historical context. We all know that the kind of science we use is in a way foreign until recently to the African situation. Africa was colonized by Western countries, and therefore the kind of science had its foundation in Western universities and Western research institutions. It is assumed that the same thinking that were developed in those universities or research institutions could directly be applied to African situation. But there is a lot done actually even during pre-colonial Africa, particularly during the late 19th century, when we had many European travelers crisscrossing Africa, both west, south, and east, and north, and these people have left behind very useful documentary evidences on the situation of African environment. It has always been used, use of fire and grazing and farming and so on. Nevertheless, from these travelogues of the European, particularly those published in the Royal Geographical Journal, one would notice that environments in Africa were in very good condition by the time of the coming of the Europeans. You can start that from 1920s, for example, or 1916, from when we actually have had proper documentations of the environmental situation within Africa. So what was pre-colonial environmental situation of East Africa? I will limit myself to East Africa in this particular discussion. What was it like? There were even at that time, actually, some thinking. People like David Livingstone and others have come up with the idea that there was a desiccation process. Environments in Africa were drying up, assumingly that the environmental change was such that Africa was drying up gradually. And of course, they used certain evidences that they found in the field, such as depending on the time of the year when they were traversing the African region, and they found some riverbeds were dry, which assumingly during wet season water would be flowing, or like Lake Ngami and others, the lakes were dried up, they have dried up, and therefore when they reported that there was water here but there's no water there now, then the assumption is that this environment is drying up. Then of course the African tradition that there is rain-making ceremonies. The assumption to the European travelers was that it's because the environment was drying that the African witch doctors, or whichever is the case, the wise men or whatever, were actually making rainfall ceremonies that will help the rains to come. Of course, this has been disproven looking at climate history of some of the mission centers in West Africa and Southern Africa and so on, which later showed that in fact the environment, the climate within African environment has been fluctuating There were dry periods and wet periods, and therefore one cannot say that gradually Africa was drying up. That one was false. Nevertheless, it is on this basis, while these ideas were floating around, that colonial science or Western science came. And our focus is on the grazing land in particular. So, by 1930s, something happened within African context and also other areas of the world. 1930s was a very dry decade when the environmental pressure was such that droughts were running for 7 years, like in Western United States, for example. This is the period when they call the period of dust bowls, that there was so much soil in the air, dust being blown up. And within the Sahara Desert, for example, and other deserts, there were huge dust bowls. And that was associated with misuse of the land by indigenous populations. So some ecological theories were developed along that line by 1930s. We can use an example of Clements, for example, who developed a theory that if you put more livestock on the grazing land, then those livestock are likely to overgrade the environment, and therefore the dust is the product of that misuse of the grazing land as such. So stocking rate, what is called stocking rate, is the number of animals per unit area, per time, for any landscape is fixed. That is the assumption of Clements, for example. Therefore, animal densities, where the animals gather for a long period of time, is the cause of overgrazing, and deforestation of land leads to things like desertification. Just to pose an example of this desertification issue, on which actually I was involved in some desertification project in early 1980s in northern Kenya. UNESCO manned the Biosphere program, a project called IPAR. I have a colleague here, Dr. Galwap, from Kargi, I suppose. We had a station there. And I was involved in education and training of pastoralists, myself and another colleague from that area, who is not alive now. And we had a very energetic team leader, Walter Lusigi, a person I would remember for the rest of my life. I think he made me who I am today academically. But there was something important that Walter Lusigi told me about this particular project on desertification. Marsabit County was supposed to be actually a test ground to show or otherwise demonstrate that pastoralist land use was one of the causes of desertification. And as one of the first projects, probably well-funded by the German government through UNESCO, this project had everything you can think of as a researcher. For example, we had planes, we had vehicles, we had all kinds of things. We were the first even to have actually radio calls and tele machines for typing. So Walter Lusigi instructed me that when we were having visitors, and there was many seminars at that time, that in one of my presentations, every sentence or the other should have the word desertification to be mentioned. That desertification was actually the milk cow. Without it, the project will not be funded. So that's a different story. I am sure you would be able to ask that question later. Then we go back to 1930s again. There were other theoretical bases or the theoretical developments, which I call causative theories, the cause of, and most of these are anthropological. Melvin Hakovitz's Cattle Complex. Later in 1960s, we had Jared Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. And then later we had equilibrium and disequilibrium theories. Don't worry about these theories, I'm just merely explaining. Now, cattle complex meant, and this is what colonial government believed, that African life loved cattle so much that there is some complex relationship between cattle and human beings, to the extent that for them to dispose a cow will take a very long time to actually think over. And those of us who have read the colonial archives in Kenya would remember some discussions in Samburu or some other place where an administrator asked a Samburu elder whether he would have 100 skeletons of cows or 50 good cows. A Samburu would reply he would rather have the 100 weak cows, so, skeleton cows than 50, because the number is important for him. And this idea actually was the one which was woven into development concepts. And Tragedy of the Commons is also the same. It assumes that Africans would add more animals onto the additional herd that they have. And I have that experience. I already have cattle and small stock. And I would like to have more of them. But I think that was the argument. And therefore, development was, which was forced, later we will look at the colonial approach, was to minimize, to restrict stocking of rangelands, the numbers of animals. The excess animals were taken off. That was the idea. So, if we go back a little bit, by 1930s, already there was a big problem of environmental degradation, soil erosion, and soil erosion became a big project, big idea of development. By 1940s, during the Second World War and after Second World War, there were big projects, huge schemes that we cannot see them around now. Isiolo was part of these large, extensive schemes of several 100 square kilometers of grazing land set aside. Now there's a place called LMD down west of Isiolo town. And the idea was that if water is developed, fixed numbers of livestock can be brought onto that land, and then those livestock fattened and then taken to the butcheries somewhere in Nairobi or abroad, and then the value of the animals goes up because there are few animals to graze, and the more conditions improve, therefore more economical would be the work that would be done. So there were huge grazing schemes from Masai land, and later, of course, we know in northern Kenya there was also northern grazing lands. These large-scale grazing schemes were done along the idea which were developed by Clements in 1930s in the US. There was something called rotational grazing, and I'm sure if we have an Australian here, you know what I mean by rotational grazing. Of course, Australian would be much larger. So the idea is this, that if you divide a particular grazing land into 4, for example, that you can graze one paddock one season, and then another paddock another season. When you remove the livestock, the land is rested, and it is assumed that the continuous grazing is more disadvantaged than rest and graze practice. But the research did not actually show that. What the research actually showed is that there were better conditions, more live weights on continuous grazing than occasional grazing. This we can discuss, actually. You can pick this up later. Then this idea was transferred to Kenyans or to East African governments after independence in the 1960s. Same methods, same theories were used. There was little change or little inclusion of indigenous knowledge. But by the time of independence, a little bit later, there was the idea of indigenous knowledge idea then became more pricey, more important. That how did then these pastoralists survive over all this period of years, and they have resisted these developments? So there were, however, two problems. First, with independence, there were fewer scientists because African governments were not able to employ expatriates. And secondly, there was financial limitation of these research and development programs. But there was an important development during this particular time. The research shifted from government to government to international level. So the research was funded by World Bank and FAO and these big institutions later, but by the 1980s, more universities were involved in research programs. And therefore, more research was actually done. But by 1980s, there was the concept of interdisciplinary research, which involved conglomerates of universities, and we now happen to be of that generation, myself and Ian and others. We were part of large research organizations. One of the large research organizations during the 1980s was UNESCO Man and the Biosphere, and I was part of that for 11 years. Therefore, I know a little bit about this. So the research moved from small plots or paddocks to larger ecosystems. So we started thinking of ecosystem research, large scale. Now this large scale research is closer to what pastoralists would use. Pastoralists use landscapes and more landscapes, heterogeneous landscapes, and they put that together for grazing purposes. Also in other places, in the US and the European countries, there's what is called long-term ecological research. And then this is the time of ILCA. The present IRRI, there was ILCA, International Livestock Center for Africa, I suppose that's what it was called. And it was there in Bamako, in West Africa, in North Africa, East Africa, everywhere, more or less. Huge scale projects. Then the idea of systems analysis. System analysis now comes closer to what we are now doing. So in development, you don't look at one issue. We have livelihood problems. Here we talk about resilience. Then there is drought. Then there is problem of land degradation, loss of biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and so on. So a lot of subjects were involved. So systems analysis means analyzing the systems as it operates. A lot of things. You combine hydrology, vegetation, human beings, soils, and so on. So this required international scientific collaboration, which came up. And therefore, this brought up the idea of paradigm shift in the thinking of the science. Instead of this very sporty research that we conducted, you go there and catch lizards and some few birds and so on, and talk of that as a research. Now we talk of the whole, for example, the Wasonyiro riparian forest. So Wasonyiro riparian forest is treated as a particular ecosystem. That ecosystem contains a lot of things, and there's so much land use. There's local land use, there's wildlife, there's forestry, there's invasive species. So there would be a lot of things that you would talk about. So the idea shifted, paradigm shift. The paradigm shift is from equilibrium, something predictive related to stocking rates, which says there are only 20 units of livestock that can graze here. Now, disequilibrium is the question of variability, that African environment is variable. It has always been variable, and this is the problem that we have when we talk about climate change, although this is also important, but then we have to be conscious that we live with variability, and change takes a decade, 10 years, 100 years, and so on. So this thinking, and we have an opportunity here, Ian Scones is one of those who actually, him and Roy Bank, who brought about, I mean, the idea has been there, but they are the ones who actually, through seminars like these ones, in Zimbabwe and later in London, brought up this idea of, expounded on this idea of disequilibrium ecology. And I am sure he will be able to talk to you about this. The idea of disequilibrium ecology includes the interdisciplinarity of research. So in my conclusion, what has remained and what has changed? What has changed and what has not changed? We still use the same theory which has been fixed. For one reason, there is little concurrence between research and development. If you are to draw a graph, development actually, nobody hears of, I have not heard of any large-scale grazing scheme in Kenya, for example, for over a long period of time. Since the 1980s, 1990s, no, nothing. Nobody talks about them. Nobody can fund. There's no funding. Although technically, probably we are more able to cope with it now than we did during those periods. Some old ideas still persist related to environmental degradation, desertification, and so on. The question we ask ourselves is, why is it that there is more motivation to fund projects linked to some of these old ideas, but not new ideas, like disequilibrium? I have not heard of any project that has used the idea of disequilibrium, although this is big science now, and a lot has been written about it. So, yet from development perspectives, therefore, there are few works which are used to design projects, and this is one major limitation. Many developments still are conducted without research. And a lot of research material which is available is not used for designing development projects. And that has been a problem which you will discuss during this particular during this week, whichever is the case. And I think many of you have also experienced this. Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein.
So I want to throw it back to you. What thoughts, what questions, what comments have this maybe generated in your mind?
I am Tahira Mohammed. I work with International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, a center called Jamil Observatory. And my question really is, for this science, we have people who translate and broker the knowledge. So what is their role and what challenges, for example, like people like you or even Ian, who have been really challenging the received narrative or this narrative?
My name is Festus. I work for Velhunga Ilfe, Kenya. They are creatures of events of recent times. So that we understand, for example, the data system. Is it really a traditional, indigenous, ancient system, or is it something that just came about some other time? Is it really, does it belong to the people? Or is it something that was really introduced over time, like you were speaking?
In the context of pastoral or African or specifically arid and semi-arid region, what is it that we need to do?
My question is, how is these county methodologies or the boundaries within counties affecting this approach? So Kenya is now devolved. We have counties. how is this boundary mentality or the county mentality affecting this whole approach, the ecosystem approach? So we as practitioners, what can we do to encourage county governments and the national governments to ensure that we encourage this ecosystem approach in pastoral livelihoods? Thank you.
The other challenge we have as dryland communities is that nowadays we used to have cattle rustling, traditional thing, but today it has been made what? Almost economical, where people in other areas are the people who come and steal from us and it is sold. So it becomes now a business, so it's being stolen from us. Then the other challenge is, which I'm after observing around here, I'm getting excited. There are people who are traditional, not pastoralists, who tell us about how to keep animals. 2 years ago, I went for a conference in Nairobi about national livestock, whatever. And the person who lectured there in front of me was coming from Nyanza, a fish keep grower, you know. He said, I know about livestock. And I was listening to me, trying to learn when my great-grandfathers were pastoralists. So I asked them, how do you tell us about livestock and wewe ni mute samaki? And the second speaker was from central Kenya, who grows coffee and tea. You know, that's a challenge we have. It's more importantly, our pastoral communities need to wake up and appreciate their role in pastoral, industry. Dryland, it is only us who can change, because others believe our way of life is backward, and we have the professor says we have to import knowledge or skills from other areas which are not even relevant to us. But pastoralism is good, and I still believe, the way my dad told me, nomadic pastoralism is the best practice. If we manage well, then probably we can do it better. Thank you, Professor.
Let me give it back to you, Prof. Just quick responses to some of the things that people are concerned about.
The issue of data was raised. The question is whether it is really a recent introduction or some indigenous system. Data is actually an indigenous system. The Boran have very systematic method of managing natural resources, varied from water to grazing lands. But of course, like in no other places, these are also breaking down. The main reason is that there's superimposition of the grazing association borders, traditional grazing association borders, with administrative borders, whereas the administrative borders have systems for kind of enforcing certain rules and regulations. The traditional borders are somehow fading away. So there is a great danger that actually the data system might just be ignored because there are many alternative land use systems emerging. With regards to the question of ecosystem basis of land use and grazing and so forth, ecosystem is really the actual unit, space within which the pastoralists organize their grazing system. They have the wetlands, the drylands, also within the drylands, there are wetlands, but otherwise also there are areas which they have allocated as wet season grazing and dry season grazing. These are often huge areas which are heterogeneous landscapes involving moving livestock from one area to the other. And these are captured very well in their ethnography, where the herders actually vocalize these movements of livestock from different ecosystems to the other during different periods, and they are praise songs for the herders, particularly those herders of notable repute who look at this. So ecosystem approach is important. It is really the scale at which land is used by herders. Of course, we realize that I think pastoralism is now living in more complex situation than they were before many years ago. And those of us a little bit older in the research now, myself and Ian, I think we are very lucky to have come across, a long time and have seen all the kind of transitions. When I was going to school, there were group ranches working on. In the Maasai there, I think we did some field work there during my university days at Kenyatta University. And the group ranches are still there, but they are being privatized now, or semi-privatized. So things have changed. The Samburu, we attended. I also went to Samburu some time ago. And at that time, there was, and of course, from historical point of view, the Samburu probably, among all the groups in northern Kenya, have had the most conflict with settlers, particularly European settlers and the pastoralists, and their system of land use. So you look at all the pastoralists, with the exception of the Turkana, to a certain extent, I think the Gabra, to a certain extent, all the others, their systems of land use have been, or Rendile, in addition to Rendile, but the greater part, for the greater part, the majority, their land use system have been altered because of their alternative land use systems. Nature reserves, mining, alternative ways of land use, privatization, and Isiolo suffers from this. Perhaps the worst, following the Maasai land, I think the area with the worst levels of land use conflict is Isiolo. Well, we realize that pastoral land use is an adaptive system, and they have always adapted, following all these kind of changes where their land use is shrinking because of alternative land uses, imposition of administrative borders, either county borders or ward borders, or whichever is the case, on their systems of natural resource use. And everywhere you go, and things are becoming very difficult. I've had the advantage of looking at the colonial archives, for example, from the beginning, early 1909, specifically, particularly for Moyale and Marsabit, and followed how these changes had occurred. And it's a pity to see that so much change has come about, and that things are more complicated. So land use, and the future is actually complicated, I would say. And as I told you that I am already also a herder to to a certain extent. I have goats, and I don't have camels like Dr. Hussein, but I have cattle and more than 100 and something goats. But I am also getting worried, as a matter of fact. One is access to land, because some of the land, for example, in our home area is fragmented. There are a lot of range enclosures going up. These are land tenure changes coming up from within the community. The community just fence up pieces of land, and this is expanding. Where I come from, actually, you could say now about 20% or 25% of the land is out of communal use. So the question is, the community, all the community, including those who enclose the land, are sending their livestock to the areas which are not enclosed. So the question is, things are becoming very complicated in this sense. Yes, the question of gaps between research and development has always been there. And particularly, I have not been around, of course, now for many years, and therefore I must say here, I don't have that experience, personal experience. Of course, most of my research, or all of it nearly, is done in East Africa, particularly Kenya and southern Ethiopia. But I have not seen anyone arguing using science to design a development program. Development program applications, for example, development for those who depend on donor funding, some ideas just come from somewhere which is fundable, and then these ideas, you are told to develop a proposal. So the proposals are developed, but these are not based on scientific findings as such. So there is a disconnection still, and this is something historical also. The question of water harvesting is very important. When we are coming to this place, we saw a place, somebody is doing some irrigation here, and what they have done, I don't know if it is rainwater harvesting or capturing, just putting a pipe. But what they have done is excavate an area and put some plastic bag in, and then water flows into that. I don't know why we pastoralists are not doing that, because during rainy season like now, there's plenty of water. But just a couple of months ago, we were buying water, as a matter of fact, which is a new way of managing livestock now. Alternative land use, I think, was mentioned, including mining. In Kenya, we also have that problem. Now we have oil, we have huge wind powers, and we have mineral sites. And this land is likely to go excluded from grazing, which means that, in effect, they will kind of shrink the communal grazing land. So that's a problem I am sure that you will have enough time to discuss, because this is a common problem. Well, the question is, the issue of climate change definitely is not new. It is historical. It has always been, from Cretaceous time to up to now. Climate has always been changing. So the question is, of course, the kind of climate change we are talking about now and the historical one, are the causative factors the same or different? That is the question that one might ask. And of course, there are many arguments. We know that actually the major causes of climate events are global hemispheric pressure systems, like El Nino and so forth. You know about that, I'm sure. And these effects are the ones that influence the weather systems globally. But at the local levels also, there are various arguments that land use can actually be associated with changing climates. And there are research here and there, but I am not quite sure whether I can have any factual evidence to explain that this particular system of land use contributes more to climate change than the other. No. Even information like a carbon sequestration and carbon sink and others, we have very little information. You can imagine, at least in northern Kenya, I can say, and most of East Africa, there's limited research done on these expansive grazing lands. If you go to other countries like the US, where I was luckily, or UK, where iron comes from, every bit of land there is documentation. Varied from the government or the state to non-state to individuals, there's a documentation. But we have vast grazing lands where there's no documentation. So we talk about desertification, but we have no scientific information about our own land, actually. And this is the challenge that I would like my friend, yourself, who are advising the county government to think about. Why wouldn't you carry some range survey of Isiolo County, for example, so that you know what kind of natural resources you have? And particularly this is important because in Kenya now there is the idea of registering community land. And one of the most important factors to be considered is inventory of the resources that communities would have. This would be in terms of natural resources, both biological and physical resources. That need to be done, and that has not been done, as far as I know, throughout the counties that we have in the arid lands. Thank you.
Prof. One question only, comment. If it's a comment, just one comment. If you have an extra one, let's post it there. We will have a look at it. So please.
My name is Abbas from FCDC. My question is only one. In Kenya, most of the poor counties are the pastoralist counties. 9 out of 10 of the poorest counties in Kenya are the pastoral counties. So what is not adding up that we are pastoralist and we are the poorest? Thank you.
My question would be, Now, we have talked about this, and I think there's a lot of research, very good input here. We know the challenges that are there. How do we strike a balance for socio-economic development through pastoralism and sustainable use of these fragile ecosystems?
So if research does not show that the pastoralism is significantly better than the continuous grazing, then what does that mean in terms of Kenya's Singapore dream?
Now, my question is, whose research? Whose research and who is research? Who owns this research?
So in this variability, what is unique to Drylands? What is unique to us?
I looked at this morning before I came, the budgets done in the arid lands for 23 counties. And then looked at what they prioritized since 2013. And when I looked at that kind of analysis, I just saw it was infrastructure heavy.
Now, I think the discussion is the use of science for development, whether there is a link between you do science and then you apply that knowledge from science for development purposes. Here we have gaps, definitely. Most of our development programs are not related to research at all. Maybe small reports which are written afterwards. This is the outcome of the implementation, but that is not scientifically supported. One interesting thing would be, I think one question was, somebody asked whose research? I think that is a very valid topic. The question is whose research are we doing? And actually, unfortunately, most of big research that was conducted here since 1930s through 1980s or 1960s, let us say 1960s, are not indigenous. Few African scientists. It is only after 1990s that we have had a few individuals who are qualified to talk about range science, for example, in northern Kenya. I can count among them myself, who did a doctorate in range science and practiced it, and there are not many who come also from pastoral background. Now, the interesting thing is this. Of course, we all have had different opportunities. Most of us have gone to school, and we have had different opportunities. You know the evidence? The evidence is that they would say, this land is so degraded that even after birth of a camel or a cow cannot pick any litter of grass except soil. You know, what do you call it? Habarbadaite. Habarbadaute. Now, Rendile would say Habarbadaute, and Borana would say Barbadadilun Ubinfun, meaning that it is so degraded that even the afterbirth of cattle cannot pick up litter. That means that area is degraded. But it does not say, however, that area has lost its utility. No. It is only for that season that if there is a rainfall and there is more water infiltration into the soil, the environment bounces back again. So it is a temporal kind of classification or, I don't know, a reflection on what is the situation at that particular time. Thank you.